Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's LinkedIn Live. My name is Sarah Barnes-Humphrey. I'm the founder and host of Let's Talk Supply Chain, Blended Podcast, founder of the Blended Pledge. And I am excited to be collaborating once again with the team at Blue Yonder. Now, they've joined me on Let's Talk Supply Chain a few times already. We've got episodes 417, 434, and 497. If you want to look those up on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, they will be there for you. We also have two brand new episodes coming up in 2026, one in a couple of weeks and the second next month. And of course, Saskia, I also interviewed our guest today and colleague, Andrea Morgan Van Dome, for our Woman in Supply Chain series. And those were episodes 484 and 503. So it's amazing to have Saskia back on the show. We were just on Thoughts and Coffee yesterday as well. And for anyone joining us for the first time, fear not, because there's so much Blue Yonder content for you to dive into after the conversation. And we will link to some of those episodes in the comments as well if you'd like to go check those out. But today we're talking about sustainability. Now, it seemed like we talked about it all the time and then crickets. Now I think we're in a bit of trouble because according to recent data, 84% of companies are off track to meet net zero targets. And the obstacles really are only just going to grow. So we need to refocus on sustainability and we need to do it fast. So Saskia and I are here to tell you why and how. We'll be diving into why sustainable supply chains are so important and how they support the circular economy. We'll be talking about tackling the biggest challenges and why sustainability priorities are being hindered by uncertainty in the market. We'll also be sharing the top tips and mindset tricks to help your company shift sustainability from cost center to strategic advantage. Now, also check out the QR code at the top right-hand corner because we've got some additional information and a quiz for you based on today's topic. So go check that out. And remember to let us know in the comments where you are tuning in from. Give us a fire emoji throughout the show if you are enjoying the conversation. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments as well, because we want to hear from you. We want this to be a conversation between us and the audience. We want to get those sustainability questions answered. And so make sure to put that in the comments. Now, before we dive in, welcome to the show, Saskia. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Feel so lucky to be back-to-back conversations with you.
Right? Yesterday was great. If anybody missed the Thoughts and Coffee episode, we talked about all sorts of stuff. And actually, we had so many questions from the audience that we're bringing some of those back for today's conversation because they were really, really great. So for anybody who doesn't know you, didn't watch Thoughts and Coffee yesterday, can you introduce yourself, give us a bit of your background and what you do at Blue Yonder?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me back on the show. Looking forward to the conversation. I know last time we talked a little bit about my background and what I've been doing in sustainability, but I'm really excited to dive in more closely on sustainability in the supply chain. My role is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Blue Yonder. We are an end-to-end supply chain management platform. And my team and I have been working on bringing carbon reduction and waste reduction, as well as traceability, into all of the aspects of the supply chain. And we also look at our internal operations and make sure that we have empathy for what our customers are facing around carbon measurement and waste reduction. So really lead that end-to-end strategy for Blue Yonder.
Awesome. And this is a big topic, right? It did kind of go quiet. I feel like maybe for 2025, I'm not sure about 2024, but it did go a little bit quiet. And now, when this data is coming out that I mentioned in the intro, it really sets the tone for, okay, what are we going to do about it? We have to stop being so quiet about it. And so that's why I love the fact that we're talking about this today.
Yeah, and I think we can also level set between the conversation that we may be hearing and what's actually happening behind the scenes. I've been at the National Retail Federation this week and have had the chance to talk with a lot of customers, and we work really, really closely with our customers. So happy to share some insights behind the scenes around what's really happening on sustainable supply chains.
Yeah, I would love to sort of get the tone of where people are at right now, right? So I think it feels, a little strange to me because I've been talking about sustainability for a long time. I've got a LinkedIn learning course about the fundamentals of sustainable supply chains. But I think, for us to move forward in the conversation, let's go back to the basics, right? Just a little bit. So, talk to me about why our listeners and businesses across the world really why do they care about sustainable supply chains? How are they thinking about sustainability right now? Let's dive into some of those insights that you garnered at NRF.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many impacts that come from supply chains in general. We work with global multinationals, and these companies have vast impacts, everything from resource extraction, the transportation impacts, even going to end of life and some of the products and how they're managed. So there's so much opportunity there. And because we need to prioritize and really meet the customer where they're at, we've been focusing on carbon reduction, waste reduction, and traceability through the supply chain. And that's really rooted in the fact that 60% of global carbon emissions still come from supply chains. They
Mm-hmm.
hold more than 5% more carbon intensity than the rest of the business.
Right.
And they're also harder to address, right? We know that, take retail, for example, there's lots of things that you can do literally within your four walls to reduce your footprint, thinking about putting recycling systems in. Maybe you're changing your lighting, your HVAC to reduce energy there in the store. But the supply chain impacts tend to be, by nature of supply chains, not directly connected with the four walls. You have partners, in-tier suppliers that are ultimately influencing your footprint. So you need to go deeper into the supply chain to have that influence. And we know that on the production side, overproduction is inherently wasteful. It's not just about carbon emissions. There's tons of waste that's happening from overproduction all the way to returns and end of life. So there's tons of opportunity, especially if you look at the food sector and clothing, around reducing food waste and finding end of life solutions for apparel. Really, really passionate about fashion. And I know we talked a little bit about that
Yeah.
yesterday, but it's up to 5 billion garments produced every year that are in excess. So there's a real
Wow.
opportunity to work across the apparel sector and thinking about just better planning solutions to avoid that. And then really going back to what we're prioritizing, it's folding in the measurement and optimization across the supply chain so that we're really empowering supply chain teams to support those ambitious sustainability goals.
Yeah. Yeah, and I actually pulled out my notes from Thoughts and Coffee yesterday because you were talking about some numbers, and one of the numbers that really stood out for me on that excess inventory, and I highly recommend anybody go and read the article on Fast Company that Saskia wrote. $140 billion in lost sales just because of the excess inventory, especially in fashion. Like, we're not just talking about small numbers here. We're talking about very impactful numbers that actually impact every single one of us because fashion essentially is clothing, and every one of us has to wear clothing on a daily basis. And so we all have a part to play in all of this, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's where there's a lot more increased connectivity between the opportunities that we have around sustainability and bringing them into supply chain. I'm hoping to be able to kind of debunk some of the perceptions that sustainability always comes at a cost, because as you pointed out, there's so much left on the table just through our wasteful practices and emissions.
Yeah, so let's talk about that because I know that was really a big part of the conversation that you and I had yesterday. Let's dig into the concept of sustainability as a competitive advantage, but I almost want to say we were talking about it being like a revenue driver. And changing the way that we think about things, because often sustainability is seen as a cost center. But I know that, through our conversations, Blue Yonder really champions it as a strategic imperative, but also it can be a revenue driver, like I just said. How have you seen the conversations shift recently? Is it a mindset shift? Is it the way that we're talking to each other, professional to professional, leader to leader? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I want to go back to the intro and where you were saying that so many companies are really off target when it comes to
Yeah.
sustainability. goals that they're set. And those sustainability goals are enduring. And I definitely continue to hear that at NRF and also from customers that there's net zero goals to 2030, 2035, sometimes beyond that. But companies are staying committed to reducing their footprints. So it's really about diagnosing what's not happening for us to see the achievement and progress that we're hoping to make, especially around waste and carbon. And one of the main, especially from a technology standpoint, that we see time and time again is that supply chain and sustainability have been separate domains. And you see sustainability teams, and we work, with lots of companies, and it's very natural to be siloed. And a lot of times that leads to deep expertise and efficiency because you can, divide and conquer responsibilities. But when you have sustainability and supply chain siloed when it comes to data and decisioning, that's where we're seeing the lack of progress towards some of those really, really challenging goals that we were referencing. So it also requires kind of a mindset shift around how sustainability can be synonymous with resilience, especially in supply chain. And hopefully that will resonate with supply chain leaders because of all the disruptions that we have been facing, everything from geopolitical events, climate impacts are disrupting supply chains. Yeah. So now we need to think about how can sustainability really empower and build the resilience that you need in supply chains. And we have a lot of solutions around network visibility and supplier scorecarding and things like that that can support that. But to go to the point around how it's a business advantage, there's lots of risk mitigation. So I mentioned the climate resilience and how that can fold into risk mitigation. That is truly an investor issue and a stakeholder issue. It's not yet regulated in the US to report on climate emissions, but it's considered best practice for most companies to do that. And we do see that ultimately investor preferences and access to capital is unlocked when you have sustainability and transparency built into the business. The other thing, and we do a lot of surveys, hopefully I'll have a chance to share some of the sustainability insights from those surveys because that's really data-driven strategy for Blue Yonder. But what we hear is that 78% of consumers still say that sustainability consideration are very important when they're choosing to buy a product. So thinking about the business advantage when it comes to brand perception and accessing that shopper, that continues to be really important. And then the last thing I'll touch on is what we were mentioning around increased efficiency can not only reduce emissions and waste, but also improve costs. We see that all the time. I'll use transportation as an example. We work with a lot of companies just to optimize their transportation plans, transportation routes. That leads to fuller truckloads, so you're not shipping as many trucks, and reduce fuel costs because you're not shipping things as far. It also greatly helps companies that are trying to shift from air freight to either ocean or truck freight, which is much less expensive and also greatly reduces the carbon footprint from that. So the nice thing that I've really enjoyed about working in sustainable supply chain is that there's much less of a trade-off between the cost and the environmental footprint. And truly you can see the ROI being really favorable for companies.
Well, and what you're talking about is impact across the organization. So what you mentioned was, the impact to the bottom line, but then you also mentioned the impact to the brand reputation. 78% is still a pretty big number. I don't know if anybody saw it, but my eyebrows raised because I was a little bit surprised that it was still at 78%, I'll be honest. But then you also mentioned access to capital. So if you're an organization that is looking for funding and things like that, I mean, this has to be part of your strategy. And so it really touches on a whole bunch of things. But the other thing that you said at the beginning was the internal collaboration and that we've got to break down the silos. And it's so interesting because I feel like across the board, all of the topics that we're talking about within supply chain, whether it's visibility, whether it's AI, whether it's sustainability, everybody is saying the same thing around the fact that we need to break down silos for all of this to work and for this to be a competitive advantage and something that organizations are going to be able to benefit from. And I feel like, why are we talking about this still when everybody's on the same page about it, but we're having a hard time breaking down those silos to maximize the benefit of all of this?
I totally agree. And we hear it a lot. And I do think companies are actively addressing it because they've known it's an issue for a while.
Right.
And we hear, one of the big words is transformation. And we see that within transforming supply chains, transforming tech stacks just to break down silos. And that's the exciting thing about technology is that it can truly be a silo buster because all of a sudden you have shared data, you have shared visibility at the point of decision making, and that's incredibly powerful.
A silo buster. I think we need to coin that term. I love that. I'm going to use that. But I think also the other part of it is that maybe I'm just a little bit impatient because it does take some time. And I really wish we were talking more about collaboration than still being siloed. But it's coming, right? Saskia, what you're saying is that it's coming. Organizations are focused on it and it's coming. Okay. So how do organizations actually do this, right? We know change management is a challenge at the best of times. Budgets can be tighter right now. Where do they start with this mindset shift? And a lot of times when I'm talking about technology, the transformations are literally only about 20% technology. The rest of that is the change management, the mindset shift, et cetera, et cetera. So where do they start? Where would you suggest that they start?
Well, there's especially within supply chain management, we always start kind of naturally with planning. And planning sets the pace for the next quarter, the year, even further along. And we see, especially from a supply chain sustainability perspective, that companies are planning towards maybe 2030 goal or a 2025 goal, which is now passed. So the need for planning to not only take into consideration all of the different supply chain impacts, but also the sustainability impacts, that's a natural place to start. And one of the exciting things going back to how companies may be missing goals today is that planning enables companies not only to look backwards and report, which is really important for, I mentioned the shareholder reports or for investors, or maybe some of the regulatory compliance that we see both in Europe, California, and other states, but also for the ability to influence future plans. And that's where it gets really exciting because you're thinking about not just accountability and traceability, but also optimization of carbon and waste into the future. So that really supports the goals, the ability for companies to meet and make progress towards goals that they've stated. The second place I would also look is actually on returns. And we talked a little bit about this yesterday, but great conversation at NRF around the NRF REV, which is the reverse logistics. And they were talking not only about the need for more efficiency in returns, but really how you can take returns into a strategic advantage because you can do much more detailed decisioning around where returns are going. It could go back into inventory so that you can sell the product before it becomes waste. It can go into a re-commerce channel. It can return to vendor. So there's a lot of new decisioning that can come from better returns management. Also a great conversation around re-commerce in general and how many, not just fashion brands, but across the sector, lots of different retail categories, including home fixtures and electronics and appliances are all getting into both re-commerce as well as refurbishment, which is really kind of the holy grail.
Well, and I think another place to start, I'm going to go back to this QR code at the top of the right side of the screen. Go ahead and click that because you have a sustainable maturity assessment. I think that's a great place to start too, because you can really assess where you are on the sustainability journey and what you need to do. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think it just came from a natural place in working with customers because everyone is at a different place and has either a different set baseline that they've already set, or maybe regulatory pressure or internal pressures that they're facing in order to meet sustainability goals. And the technology and really the strategy and the change management is a byproduct of where you are in that maturity assessment. And honestly, we work with a lot of companies that really are still in that measurement stage, and they need to improve their reporting. They need to improve their internal and external data collection because it's taking them a lot of time and it's inefficient, it's inconsistent. So measurement is a fantastic way to start that journey and really have a better baseline that allows you to track over time and see how you're progressing towards goals. And then they move into more of that optimization phase and trying to include things like waste reduction and carbon reduction as a decision-making factor in future optimization. But it's just a more mature place. And you really do want to have good measurement before you move into that next phase.
Absolutely. I want to give a shout out to Heather. She gave us some fire emojis over on my personal LinkedIn. Just a friendly reminder to everybody in the audience. We want to know where you're tuning in from. Feel free to add some questions into the comments. And then, of course, if you're loving the conversation, we'd love to see some fire emojis, some more fire emojis as well. Now, you talked about instability, uncertainty, disruptions, and we've seen a lot of uncertainty in supply chains. You mentioned climate events. There's also geopolitical instability. How are you seeing this uncertainty impact sustainability initiatives? How is it really impacting how we think about it, how we move through it, how we implement? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, again, I'd like to be grounded in some data because MIT does a fantastic survey and report that's the state of sustainable supply chains. And they've been doing this for many years. And so they have some great baseline data and continue to track how companies are addressing sustainability. But just last year, at the end of the year, they announced that 80% of businesses believe that sustainability is important or extremely important. So we know it's still really, really important for companies. And you mentioned that we haven't been hearing, quite as much publicly about it. I see and hear from other sustainability leaders that sustainability has shifted from kind of a marketing and at a certain point, you heard companies almost like competing on sustainability and setting, frankly, goals that didn't have real strategy or funding or operational activity underneath them to support it. Now we've shifted into an era that I think is a lot more realistic. It's a lot more action oriented, where sustainability is much more operationalized throughout the organizations. And that's where, again, the supply chain really plays a huge role. And again, back to the MIT survey, 85% of organizations reported no change or an increase in efforts in sustainability. So continue to see that be an enduring priority. So when we go back to like the shift from sustainability as more of like a marketing initiative to being more operationalized, that's where you can see overlap between the opportunities to do risk mitigation. There's a couple of regulations in Europe that require companies to report deeper supply chain risk associated with climate change. That's something that Blue Yonder's been building through our network solution. We have an integration with third-party risk assessment platforms, so you can see direct risk in your direct suppliers, but also indirect risk that may be from an in-tier supplier that's related to a climate risk or a geopolitical risk. So we see a lot of interest in that as a way to build more resilience in the supply chain. And then just going back to the issue around silos and lack of data visibility, one of our large grocery customers that we're working with, they have a company-wide sustainability goal. They have a carbon reduction goal, and then they are more mature in their sustainability program. So they have set carbon reduction goals for their supply chain team and their transportation team. But on a day-to-day basis, those teams don't actually have the visibility for understanding how they're decisioning, whether they're choosing route A or route B, how that affects their footprint. So this is, again, where technology can be a silo buster.
Well, and I also think the regulations that you're talking about are also really going to play a big part in all of this. And we mentioned some of it yesterday. A lot of the times when we think about regulation in sustainability, we're talking about Europe, right? Europe really drives a lot of this, and they are really committed to it, and they're putting parameters in place for organizations to really drive sustainability to the top of that priority list. But I'd like to just take a moment to touch on how that is moving into North America, because one of the things that I learned yesterday in our conversation was that some of that is moving, at least into some of the states within the US, that's really going to make a difference and help drive this conversation back to the top of that priority list. Can you talk a little bit about some of those that are coming into play that we need to think about as organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say the general theme is that Europe is setting the pace. So if you're in a marathon and you're trying to beat your record, you're following Europe in terms of the regulations that are being set. But I think the nice thing about that is now Europe is defining the standards that companies must follow, and that's creating a little bit more consistency. It used to be that companies were kind of all reporting on different standards. There wasn't really one alignment around metrics and things like that. Now Europe, by defining what those standards are, there is a little bit more consolidation, which helps multinationals that we work with. But then we also see not only states in California or states in the US, but also other countries like Australia, New Zealand, India. They're all essentially copying the frameworks from Europe. Mm-hmm. And that's, again, providing good consistency for our global multinationals that have to report and operate in all of those different places. But it also is creating more harmonious metrics so you can compare apples to apples. Some of the regulations that I was talking with companies at NRF and see a lot more pressure, especially around traceability and tracking, are extended producer responsibility regulations for packaging. So any manufacturer of consumer goods or any retailer has to be tracking at a really detailed level what types of packaging they have within their supply chain. In Europe, they also have to track, is it a pulp source, a paper source that might go back to an old growth forest, and or could there be anything deeper into the supply chain that would be affecting the sustainability of that material? They also have to track recycled content or recyclability at a really detailed level. And those systems, the technology doesn't really support that level of detail of tracking today. Right. So companies are kind of scrambling to figure that out. So that's on the packaging side. And then yesterday we were also talking about the fashion pressures, and I think this is something to really keep your eye on, because there is a regulation now in California that applies to the apparel and footwear industry that's more focused on circularity and end of life, but it's requiring manufacturers to put in place anything from better recycling options to re-commerce options for products, so that it's going to put pressure on the front end not to overproduce, because you're going to have to make sure that any garment or footwear that you're producing has an end-of-life option. And right now there's still a lot of overproduction, but then also creating more options around returns and circularity and re-commerce. Again, those themes that I was hearing at NRF. Mm-hmm. So that's something that's happening right in our backyard. And again, looking just briefly at Europe, there's a new regulation kind of putting into full force this year that prevents brands from disposing of any unsold garment. So that could be, I think we mentioned up to 5 billion garments globally. It's a lot of garments are still being overproduced, but that also includes not being able to recycle those garments. So again, putting the pressure on better planning and reducing overproduction to begin with.
Yeah, it's forcing to rethink overproduction, in that first mile, right? And then also forcing them to think, okay, well, if I do have overproduction, what can I do with that? And that actually leads to a lot of innovation in around the fact that there could be some new revenue streams like we were talking about earlier. But this also makes me think about the assessment that you have, and we've got the link in that QR code to anybody who wants to take it. You need to be prepared, and you need to know where you stand before these regulations come in, so that you know that you are prepared when they do come in, that you can then turn that on fairly quickly, or at least make small steps towards it rather than it being a reactive move later on. And so when you were talking about that, I was like, wait a second, this assessment is truly something that every organization, supply chain team should be doing to figure out where you land so that you can actually be prepared. Because we talk about it being in Europe, but you also mentioned it being in California. It is coming. It's not a matter of it not coming. It's going to be coming to the US, and you're going to have to think about these things. And so where do you land on that scale, and how much do you need to do to be prepared for something like that?
Yeah, it's a great point. And that's where we see companies actually looking a bit further down the road around how they're managing sustainability is anticipation of the regulations. And by nature, usually regulations have to give advance notice for the kinds of reporting. They tend to have ramp up periods where maybe in the first year you just need to disclose and set that baseline, but then they start to ratchet down, and then you can't dispose of products. And over time, it becomes more and more stringent. So that gives companies a little bit of a runway, but the runway is now in front of us. So that's where we see companies really choosing to act.
Yeah. So we've talked about mindset. We've talked about sort of where the industry is at when it comes to sustainability. Tackling sustainability isn't easy. I think we've sort of brought that to the forefront. There's a bunch of challenges. It's a bit of a puzzle that everybody's trying to figure out. Which aspect of the supply chain do you think can have the most impact on sustainability? Where can we start? I've always heard that procurement is a really great place to start when it comes to sustainability. And that is for a variety of reasons. But I'd love to hear your take as to, where we can make the most impact.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned procurement, because procurement is kind of one of the most invisible to some strategic parts of any organization. And they hold a lot of influence when it comes to who you're working with and all your different suppliers, the standards that you're choosing to use in those supplier selections, all of the raw materials and products that ultimately you end up producing. So the sustainability teams that are listening, I'm sure will resonate that they're really partnered closely with the procurement operations. And a lot of that goes back to, I think at the top we were talking about all of the impacts that come from supply chains. If you just look at purchased goods and services, that tends to be where the majority of the footprint comes from, especially for manufacturers and retailers. So that partnership is really critical. And if you're looking at not just your immediate impact, but also the total ESG performance of your company, your suppliers and the relationships that you have with them are implicit in your overall sustainability performance. So you see a lot more of ESG scorecarding. There's a little bit of survey fatigue for sure up and down the supply chain, where everyone's asking all these different surveys. We do have a network solution that helps kind of automate those survey collections. And we see a lot of innovation around how ESG surveying can be less cumbersome and take some time out of the overall system. But again, procurement is a really, really powerful one. And back to that MIT survey, I was pretty shocked by this. I don't know if your eyebrows are going to raise on this one, but more than 60% of organizations are still using spreadsheets to track sustainability in their supply chain. Ooh. And that goes back to all of the kind of inefficiency that we were talking about around data collection, inconsistency in that data. But also it's kind of keeping us in that backwards looking and it's reactive, not proactive. So going back to your question around what aspects of the supply chain can have the most impact, I truly think that it's really around that optimization and figuring out how you can use technology to develop future plans that enable waste reduction and carbon reduction. So not just the tracking, but being able to develop plans that have carbon optimization as part of those future strategies.
Well, and if you're looking at tech investments, I mean, everybody's looking at investing in technology. It's really just a matter, I think, of talking to the partner that you're looking to partner with on that technology to make sure that they have what you need from a sustainability standpoint. And I think when you talk about procurement, pressures on planning from procurement, right? So that we are reducing the overproduction. But I think it's also giving permission to procurement to push back a little bit to make sure that we're adhering to these regulations or possible future regulations, not overproducing. I mean, at the end of the day, if you've got a lot of inventory and you've got a lot of excess inventory, what does that come down to? It comes down to a lot of tied up capital. Nobody wants that.
Yeah, totally agree. And the merchants are also, especially in retail, they're really powerful because they're kind of defining the future trends and what should be bought and eventually put into store. So that's, again, where things like merchandise planning, assortment and replenishment, those are really powerful tools for taking a lot of intelligence into that inventory planning process. So we talk a lot about how we can now, through AI and through technology at large, take into account all of these different variables into that multivariate decision making. So you can think about things like hyper local preferences. Maybe there's a concert that's driving up the sale of a garment because the star had worn it in the previous week. That can happen at a really hyper local level. Things like weather, local preferences, cultural preferences when it comes to grocery stores or holidays, all of that can now be factored into creating a much more accurate demand plan. So it goes back to your point around overproduction and now sitting on all this excess capital. Now that could be prevented just through better intelligent planning.
Yeah, and we talk about it being a cost center. It's not a cost center anymore if you're putting money back to the bottom line. Now, quick question about operations. Is there a lot of opportunity within operations that we might be overlooking of where to start with sustainability?
So do you mean like transportation and warehousing and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, sort of operations as a whole. I mean, you touched on transportation in the fact that obviously there's a lot of carbon that is happening within transportation. But then I also think about warehousing. I mean, we just talked about excess inventory, and I think that that's one area, but there's other areas within that operation as far as transportation, warehousing that maybe we haven't identified in the conversation yet that I just want to bring to light of where the opportunities are that we can start to maybe shine a little bit of light, maybe ask some questions to really start getting some movement going. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, it's a great shout out. And since it's a supply chain podcast, I know that people will be familiar with the term synchronized execution. So thinking about breaking down silos and thinking about more end-to-end management of the supply chain, when you have shared data and shared decisioning between warehouse and transportation, that's where a lot of the goodness can come. We have a customer who's in the high-tech space who has a lot of batteries that have a certain shelf life, and they're in a warehouse. They need to be kind of first in, first out, because otherwise they might lead to obsolescence and expiration in the warehouse. So they've been able to synchronize their transportation with their warehouse plans and inventory plans, so they know when to ship out the products that would otherwise be expiring first. And that's led to an enormous benefit, not only from the material side, but towards some of their circularity goals. They did have circular production goals. They've been able to reduce that excess production by, or excess waste of those, and or donation or even recycling of those batteries by 40%. So it's really a powerful way to just have more intelligence and think about your inventory management when it comes to when you're planning transportation.
I'm so glad you shared that example. I think it's really good for us to be able to showcase what other organizations or supply chain teams have been able to do and what it actually has meant to the bottom line. Because even at the end of the day, when you're thinking about shipping out something that's going to expire first, it's also good for those who are putting the orders together and shipping the orders out, because they know that they are empowered to make the right decisions and that they're making an impact, whether it's small or big, towards, moving towards a more sustainable supply chain, but also a more sustainable future. Now, I want to give a shout out to Joanna over on my personal LinkedIn. She's loving the conversation. And I want to give a reminder to everybody. We are close to going to audience questions. We've got a couple from yesterday that I do want to highlight as well. But if you have any questions, now is the time to put it into the comments so that we can get to those. Now, we're hearing a lot about circular economy. You mentioned it a little bit earlier in this conversation. I think with the introduction of tariffs, the removal of de minimis exceptions, there's a lot to talk about in this arena. And one of the questions we had from yesterday does have a notation on tariffs that I want to get to. Why is the investment into the circular economy crucial for future success? Whether that's organizations, whether that's supply chains as a whole, why should people care?
Yeah, well, we're not going to even be able to probably scratch the surface when it comes to the tariff implication on supply chains, but it has been an interesting year for just seeing how companies are responding and reacting to those changes in tariffs and manufacturing locations and how that influences sustainability goals. It's really, really interesting. But just going back to de minimis in particular, there was a question at the kind of beginning of the tariff changes around how de minimis being excluded might affect some of the business models that really depended on that tariff-free import, and in particular things like fast fashion and some of those business models. And would it lead to a rise in re-commerce for not just fashion companies, but all companies? Because the more that you're selling products that you've already paid those tariff fees, the ROI on that becomes even more compelling. And I think we actually have started to see the rise in re-commerce and the rise in shopper behavior, even for re-commerced items. One of the things that was shared at NRF Rev came from Target. They were saying that 70% of consumers shopped secondhand last year in 2025.
Wow.
Yeah, it's huge. So you have to imagine, there's inflationary pressure on that, but also that tariffs could be playing a role, and consumers may be more inclined to look to a secondhand option. And going back to the refurbished argument, and companies, everything from electronics, home goods, doing refurbishment, they're selling essentially new goods that have been guaranteed by the manufacturer to work according to their specification. They've done cosmetic improvements to make them meet their standards, and then they're selling them at a lower price. So that's, I think, an excellent model, and something that we should continue to monitor as tariffs continue to put those price pressures on companies.
Yeah.
Then the other thing that, we really see a lot more around just the enablement of the circular economy through returns management is we know that about like 40 to 50% of inventory can actually be tied up in the returns life cycle at any moment. So if you're a company, a retail company, and you're thinking about your manufacturing plans or your retail inventory, if you know that some of that product is going to be coming back, how do you feed that intelligence back into your original inventory plan? So you don't need to maybe make 50 shirts if you know they're coming in through the retail, but often, again, due to silos and not sharing data, the inventory plans are not using that intelligence. So it's a huge opportunity for that information to go back, and really leads to, again, an emphasis on end-to-end supply chain management.
Yeah, especially if you already know the percentage ahead of time.
Right.
Realistically, you can plan with those kind of incentives or those percentages. Anyways, Jenny, I see your question. Paul, I see your question. We're going to get to it right after this. Now, one last question before we go to the audience questions. I think sometimes we need a bit of a fresh take to inspire meaningful action. So for the listeners, for the audience, that might be leading supply chain operations right now. What do you think is one counterintuitive piece of advice you'd give them about integrating sustainability that they probably aren't hearing from their peers? They haven't heard it from us today, and they're not hearing it necessarily from peers or leaders, or, let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, hopefully we've done a little bit of debunking around that sustainability is more expensive. That's been something my entire career, about 20 years working in sustainability, to fight against, that it's not necessarily more expensive. And when it comes to supply chain management, that's very, very true. There's lots of cost benefit in addressing sustainability in your supply chain. So I won't harp on that anymore, but I also wanted to address, especially for supply chain leaders who may be asked to take on more of a sustainability role, that it's just another thing that is going to be added to their plate. It may slow them down, or it may cause them to deprioritize other things that they're working on. The reality is it can actually create a more resilient supply chain that ultimately will make you more successful at your job. So thinking about how the interplay between having network view and being able to toggle in between suppliers when you have disruptions, that has a sustainability benefit and it has a supply chain benefit. So lots of double wins across sustainable supply chain management. Maybe I can just offer 3 steps to start to bring sustainability into your supply chain management if you haven't already. The first is really just to bring sustainability leaders to the table. We have a lot of these conversations at Blue Yonder where we traditionally have worked with supply chain leaders, and now we're inviting sustainability leaders to join in those conversations. And they really are able to connect the dots around the data collection, the visibility of decision-making, and all of the different pressures that they're facing that ultimately will have a dual benefit. So by inviting the leaders to the table, I think you'll see that you have more in common than you think, and ultimately can serve each other really well. The second would be to think about a broader network strategy. So I was mentioning the ability to toggle between suppliers and to quickly, change your route or change your supplier if you have a disruption. That's incredibly powerful. And it also leads to a lot of friendly competition among your suppliers as well. If you know that you can easily shift from one to the other, then hopefully it'll improve their overall performance and their sustainability performance. And then lastly, a lot of customers that we talk to, they are starting with measurement. It's a fantastic way to start if you are on that maturity curve, and you can't really improve what you don't measure. So having shared sustainability metrics across the supply chain teams, providing visibility for sustainability alongside things like cost, service levels, that really becomes a way to have that shared visibility and ultimately make progress towards sustainability goals.
Yeah, I don't know about anybody else, but I'm taking a ton of notes. And one of the things that stood out for me was to lean into the experts. Sometimes I feel like we need to know everything about everything, and then it gets very all consuming. And I think at the end of the day, we've got a lot of great folks within the industry, especially folks like you, Saskia, who we can really lean into and say, hey, this is where we're at. This is where we'd like to go, or this is where we need to go because we are being forced either by regulation or customers or etc. We don't want to make mistakes along the way. We don't want to make costly mistakes along the way. We want to make this a revenue driver for our organization. What do we do next? And I think we definitely need to lean into that. All right, let's get to audience questions. I'm going to start with Paul's. He uses an acronym, and I don't know what EPR is.
Okay, I do. Don't worry.
Okay, good. So do you have a few thoughts on EPR? Because he wants us to bring that up today.
So EPR, I mentioned a little bit around the California regulations, but it stands for Extended Producer Responsibility. And the principle of EPR is that not only consumers, but also the public sector has kind of paid the cost of what producers like manufacturers have generated. So thinking about just recycling program, and this probably will resonate with most people. As taxpayers, we pay municipal governments to develop trash programs, recycling programs to manage end of life for our products.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And producers, whether it be packaging producers or other manufacturers, once it gets into the consumer's hand, often they don't pay that ultimate price in developing that end of life solution. So the principle of extended producer responsibility is shifting a little bit of that cost back to the producer so that there's more of a shared responsibility for responsible end of life. So the principle would also mean that maybe manufacturers would think about the design of their products in the first place to encourage more recyclability, because then the cost will go down. Or they're thinking about developing a re-commerce model because it might be cheaper than paying for disposal. So ultimately, we've seen lots of extended producer responsibility programs. It's actually not a really new thing. It extends to electronics, mattresses, paints, even medicine, disposal of medicine. So there's a lot of good models for how it can work and create responsibility across manufacturers all the way to consumers and the public sector.
Well, and that brings me to the point where we can all play a part in this role. We all have a role to play in this. And the dollars that come out of our pocket is one way to do that. But then also, like you're saying, putting some pressure on the producers of all of these garments and products to say, hey, we're not okay with this. We're now spending, our tax dollars to make sure that we can deal with the excess inventory. What are we going to do about that? What pressures are we going to put back on those producers to reduce some of that? I love that. Thank you. That was a great point out, Paul. Thank you very much for that. Now, one of the questions from yesterday came from Michelle. Many companies are exercising their option to destroy products subject to high tariffs when there is excess. How are you seeing this factor into sustainability conversations?
Yeah, I saw that yesterday, and I've been thinking about it ever since. So really thought-provoking question, and I appreciate you bringing it forward, and would encourage you, if you have examples or things that you've heard from manufacturers or where that's happening, please share. That's a great insight that we need to definitely be aware of when we think about tariff implications. My question would also be, is that occurring upstream, so with manufacturers that exist in tariff-implicated countries, or is it happening in the U.S. once those products have already been imported and the tariffs have been levied because they don't want to maybe face the tax pressure or the cost pressure to consumers? So it's an interesting question. I do see, going back to EPR, that there is a little bit more of, pressure on reducing waste, and waste is becoming more regulated. So across the board, it's kind of hitting industry by industry and not necessarily a prohibition on waste at large, but would want to make sure that you are tracking the end of life for those products. Going back to the fashion EPR, that's the law that's being put into California, the producers are now going to have to show that any excess inventory is being disposed of responsibly, all the way to if they get they send it to a liquidator, they need that chain of custody. So again, at the NRF Rev conversations, they were bringing back the term blockchain. I was like, oh my gosh, blockchain's back. But blockchain as a way to verify that there is responsible disposal at end of life. So anyway, really thought-provoking question. Would love to learn more.
Yeah, awesome. And I just see the scroll at the bottom of the screen. It's a reminder to go and get that QR code and head over for that maturity assessment. I think you guys have a case study as well that we want people to go and check out. So the question from Jenny on this excess inventory build topic, in my opinion, the biggest driver is hypergrowth planning that is not experiencing checks, balances in S&OP. What's an example in your past, Saskia, where you've successfully linked these realities, and what has that looked like?
Well, I think, the opportunity around using more intelligence to define that inventory plan, that's where I see the insights that can come from, again, localized preferences, weather, consumer demand. We know there's a lot of variables that at any one point companies are trying to evaluate in developing that inventory plan. So by doing that on a very simple technology or a spreadsheet, you're not going to be able to take into account all those different variables. So it's really important to have some kind of technology to allow you to have that multivariate decision making. The other thing is that there's not just the inventory impact from excess inventory, it's also all of the upstream impact that comes from that, all of the manufacturing energy into extracting raw materials, actually producing that product, stitching it together, dyeing it, then transporting it back to the US. So we think about it a lot in waste terms, but ultimately it's a huge carbon footprint. We need to figure out how do we absorb some of that and avoid that in the overproduction. To point to some examples around industries that we work with, it's everyone from the high-tech sector where there's a lot of efficiency in how they're using materials because there's pressure on things like microchip demand and being able to deliver that all the way to the customer. But even in those industries, they're really focused on the circular economy because those materials are really rare. And there's a cost into accessing some of those rare metals that ultimately go into microchips and some of the AI technologies. So that puts a really positive pressure on figuring out, even if it's a down value material, how they might put that back into their manufacturing. So that's a really interesting example to look at. And then I would point to the grocery industry as being really food waste reduction oriented. Every grocer that we're working with has a food waste reduction goal, and they're using the planning process as a way to get in front of how they're putting their items in store, especially fresh things like produce and fish that have really specific expiration dates. That's where they're really focused on optimizing for availability when it can sell, but not overstocking because that's ultimately driving a lot of the waste in store.
Yeah, and essentially planning for the future when those regulations come in. I mean, that is a great example. This is exactly what it looks like to be proactive.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about reactivity versus being proactive. And sometimes I think we miss the mark because we're not necessarily sharing the examples of what that looks like. But that's an exact example of being proactive and what that looks like and how we're using supply chains to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's right. And I think even going back to the grocery example, the grocery stores are focused on food waste reduction because it does resonate with their shopper. And we work with a lot of grocers in the UK where food waste reduction is a big priority for those shopper. And you see that marketed in store as well directly to the consumer. So it's great to see that not only are they putting those ambitious goals in front of the consumer, but they're also working upstream to make sure that they avoid overproduction in the first place.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that example. I want to give a shout out to Scott over on my personal LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us. Now, Lindsay had a question from yesterday that I'm going to bring back up because I thought it was a great question. So in the EU, brands cannot landfill or recycle unsold products. I think this has to do with that new regulation coming down. And I also wonder on top of that, how are they doing that? Because if you it can't go to the landfill, you can't recycle it. What are the other options?
Right. Yeah. Well, again, I think it goes back to planning. So they need to be using better planning intelligence to not overproduce in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
We know that return rates are really high for fashion. So that's also a big opportunity just to improve consumer communication. And there's things like, and I was seeing these at NRF, now you can virtually try on products to see how they might fit on your body or on your face. So that's really a way to make sure that when the product actually hits the consumer's hands, that it is a better fit for them and they're not going to return it, which ultimately can lead to waste and also overproduction. So those are interesting strategies from a technology standpoint. But I also think what's going to happen, and this is similar to the conversations that are happening with retail in California, is the emergence of better re-commerce solutions and finding ways to get those products actually, in the hands of customers. So it has to be upstream with the planning, but then also downstream in finding some of those solutions.
We do have a quick question from the Let's Talk Supply Chain Instagram. Want to give a shout out to Dimfo Gabriel _Gabriel. EPR, it's going back to EPR. So EPR is about greening the supply chain. What would you say to that? I mean, I would obviously say, I think it's got to come down to the pressures, though, of how we put pressure on organizations, but that's just my take.
Yeah, I think one of the intentions of EPR is to green the supply chain. I would definitely agree with that. I think it's also just an acknowledgement of what we call in sustainability is like these negative externalities that come from the environmental footprint of different products or activities. Those tend to be absorbed by the public sector and paid for by the public sector, which goes back to the consumer and the taxpayer. So it's really a cost shift from absorbing those just in one part of the business or one part of the system and pushing it back onto the manufacturers and producers to play a role in designing and thinking about their role in producing products more responsibly.
All right, one more question before we get to the end. I do want to ask you sort of what's one key takeaway you want everybody to walk away with. But before we do that, I've got another audience question, and it's around emerging technologies or innovation. What has you excited in that area for sustainable supply chains in the next 5 to 10 years?
I mean, I have to say AI. And
Yeah.
this is something that we are developing at Blue Yonder, and we are integrating. So we have at Blue Yonder a number of different AI agents that we're working with customers to co-develop and independently develop. And we're not going to be creating necessarily independent sustainability agents, but our goal is to make those AI agents smart on sustainability. So going back to inventory planning, making those inventory agents understand root cause analysis. If you do see overproduction, or if you do see obsolescence happening in your warehouse, how can you use an agent to help you identify the root cause, which might be a sustainability reason, it might be an operational reason, but ultimately will serve both the sustainability and the supply chain teams. So that's really exciting to kind of make those operations more efficient, make them more effective. So we're really excited about that. And, AI really isn't new to Blue Yonder. We've been doing it for 20 years or more in different capacities. But we do see now that with these advanced language models, and we're all built on Snowflake, so those shared data from end to end is really an enabler for some of the AI efficacy and really being able to solve problems for customers.
I love the fact that we're going to be able to really drill down on sustainability in an easy way. And it's just going to be integrated into the AI agents and the conversations that we're having with those and the solutions that are being brought to our attention, that we can then utilize the scenario planning to be able to include that as a parameter. And I think that that's really exciting. What's one thing that you would like the audience to walk away either taking action on or thinking about today?
Yeah, I mean, I might just point them in the direction of the maturity assessment and do a quick review of where you feel that you're at in that sustainability journey, and to consider technology as a silo breaker, as a way to empower your sustainability teams to make progress towards the goals that you've set, and to create essentially more resilient supply chains at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think also empower your supply chain teams to understand where you're at and, what can be done, whether you have a sustainability team or not. Supply chain and procurement can really take the lead in championing this, and understanding where you're at in this moment can really help drive some of those conversations. So that's all we have time for. I want to say a big thank you, obviously, to Saskia for joining me today. I mean, companies are facing so many challenges and they're really struggling to make progress towards sustainability goals. But there are some relatively easy and cost effective strategies out there to take advantage of. There's also a lot of great technology out there for you to take a look at, and make sure that it includes some parameters for your sustainable supply chains. And I love this idea of integrating sustainability objectives into supply chain management, because I think it also creates a more holistic, manageable picture for teams to navigate, but also really see results. Because at the end of the day, that's what's going to motivate everybody. So remember, we've got a link in the comments and the QR code to that maturity assessment. Please go grab that link, start your assessment today to understand where you're going to be. It's going to rank you. It's also going to give you next steps, and also a lot of best practices that Saskia mentioned today as well. So if you're looking for a partner to help you optimize environmental impact in your supply chain, check out blueyonder.com. Saskia, thank you so much for joining me here on the show today.
Thank you, Sarah. I've loved our conversation.
Thanks, everybody in the audience. We'll see you again soon. Have a great rest